Engines hit the dirt on my land before I even stepped out of my truck. Radios crackled, doors slammed. Boats bumped the shoreline like they already belonged there. Fresh boundary stakes were driven straight through my lakefront. Bright tape, clean. Lines, miles of it across land I had just inherited. No one explained why they were there. No one asked permission. Then the noise split when she walked up, clipboard tight in one hand, the other already pointing. Chin high, voice sharp enough to take control of the moment. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked inconvenienced. She said I was out of compliance. Said the lake access was community managed. Said I needed approval to touch land I hadn't even changed. Before I could answer, she rolled straight into it. Inspections booked, rules quoted, fines mentioned like they were already written fast. Calm, like the outcome was settled, and I was just late to hearing it. That's when I realized the flip had already happened. I wasn't the owner, I was the problem. They didn't see my quiet as respect. They saw it as permission. And once I understood that there was no version of this where it ended politely. But let me start from the beginning. Before we dive into, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more interesting stories just like this. Before any of this happened, my life stayed small on purpose. Quiet. Mornings. Familiar roads. Few people knowing much about me, and me preferring it that way. I wasn't building anything bigger than I needed. I liked knowing where things stood. I liked knowing tomorrow wouldn't surprise me. I didn't realize how much that calm was about to cost. The call came on an ordinary day, which somehow made it worse. A calm voice. Careful words. Then a sentence that didn't fit the rest of my life at all. I had inherited a lake ranch. Not a parcel, not a property. Thousands of acres wrapped around open water. That was the moment everything else shrank. This wasn't something you eased into. It instantly changed the scale of things. Land like that doesn't arrive quietly, changes how people see you. Moment they hear about it, whether you want that or not, I asked them to repeat it, then sat in silence after the call ended. No rush of excitement, no plans forming. Just the understanding that responsibility had shown up without instructions. I kept the news to myself at first, not out of secrecy, but caution. I needed to see it before letting it become real. Until then it felt like someone had handed me weight I hadn't asked to carry. The drive out there took longer than I expected. Roads narrowed, signs disappeared, cell service faded. By the time I arrived, it already felt like I'd crossed into something that didn't care about schedules or convenience. I parked and sat for a moment, looking out across water and land that stretched farther than my eyes wanted to follow. The sighs didn't shout. It pressed. The lake was calm and wide, bordered by land that felt uninterested in being managed. Not wild exactly, just settled into itself. Standing there, I felt small in a sobering way. This place didn't feel like it was waiting for me. It felt like it had been doing just fine without anyone. I walked for a while, letting that sink, and each step carried weight. Not ownership presence. It's the kind that reminds you you're borrowing space, not claiming it. That's when the feeling shifted. Order, not fences. Not barriers, just structure. Signs where they didn't quite belong, markers too evenly spaced to be accidental. Paths that felt suggested rather than open. Nothing threatening, nothing obvious, just enough to say someone had already decided how this land should be approached. I told myself not to overthink it. Land has history. People leave traces behind. Still, the feeling followed me like I wasn't the first person to imagine control here, just the newest one. That night, I checked the paperwork again. Deeds, surveys, maps. On paper, everything was clean. Ownership was settled. On the ground, it felt different. The more time I spent there, the clearer it became that paper didn't carry much weight. The land told a story that documents didn't. Over the next few visits, the pattern sharpened. Certain areas felt watched, not by people, but by expectation. Access that felt implied. Movement that felt guided without being explained. The land was vast, but freedom within it felt conditional. That's when the first letter arrived. It was friendly, warm, almost congratulatory. It talked about shared values, preservation, standards. What stopped me wasn't what it said, was what it assumed. The property was mentioned like it had always been part of something larger. That was the click. This wasn't just land. It was land inside a system. More messages followed. Emails this time. Polite, helpful, full of guidance. Framed as support. Best practices, coordination, planning. I hadn't changed anything. I hadn't done anything. And still. Someone was watching how I existed there. The unease deepened. I asked light questions. Who handled what? Where expectations came from? How decisions were made. The answers were smooth and comforting, but never clear enough to settle you if you didn't push, enough to bother you if you did. Each visit after that felt different. The space was still beautiful, still quiet, but the quiet felt conditional now, like it depended on people not testing limits they hadn't been told about yet. One evening, standing by the water as the light faded, I looked out across acres that technically belonged to me and felt the weight settle fully. Not excitement, not pride, responsibility mixed with restraint. Nothing bad had happened. No rules enforced. No lines crossed. But I could feel it, the sense that this land had already decided how it wanted to be handled, that sooner or later it would expect me to fall in line. And once that thought took hold, it felt like something behind me quietly closed. The first real contact didn't arrive as a warning. It arrived as a welcome. The message was warm, carefully written, and full of good intentions. They congratulated me on the inheritance and talked about how fortunate the land was to remain within the community. That phrase stood out, even then, not near the community, not beside it. Within it, they offered support, guidance, a chance to get ahead of things. It sounded helpful, generous even, the kind of outreach that claims to save you trouble later. They suggested a meeting, framed as informal. Just an introduction, just making sure I had what I needed. I agreed mostly because saying no felt unnecessary. Nothing had gone wrong yet. The meeting took place in a small, clean room that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Everything was arranged before I arrived, folders stacked, pens aligned, seats already chosen. My chair sat slightly apart from the others, close enough to be included, far enough to feel separate. They spoke calmly and evenly. Each person took their turn. No interruptions, no drift. It felt familiar to them. Like this was how these conversations usually went. They thanked me again, welcomed me again. Then they started talking about standards, not rules. Standards, they explained, expectations meant to preserve value, safety, and harmony. Words that sound harmless until you realize how much ground they can cover: land use, shoreline management, access paths, environmental care, all reasonable, till you considered the scale. They were applying guidelines meant for small properties to thousands of acres of rural land and open water, maintenance schedules that assumed constant visibility, access controls that made sense in neighborhoods, not across miles of shoreline, restrictions that ignored how remote most of the land actually was. That was the first clear imbalance. I asked a few practical questions. How standards adjusted for size. How timelines worked when distance alone changed everything. They smiled, nodded, and used the same phrases again and again. That's flexible. We'll work with you. It's more about intent than specifics. But every answer circled back to the same point. This was how things were done. Before the meeting ended, they handed me a packet. Thick, organized, tabs marked with reassuring titles, guidelines, procedures, review processes. Nothing labeled. Optional. At home I went through it slowly, page by page. The language was calm, almost gentle, but it left little room to move. Most sections were written as if the reader had already agreed, as if the only question left was how quickly they would comply. At first, the follow-ups were light. Emails checking in, suggestions about shoreline upkeep, notes about recommended inspection timelines. Each message ended warmly. Each one implied they were helping me stay ahead. I replied politely, asked for clarification, explained I wasn't planning changes yet, and wanted time to understand the land. The responses came back fast and smooth, reassuring but firm. They emphasized alignment, consistency, preventing future issues. The word guidance came up often. So did expectation. The shift happened slowly. Suggestions arrived with dates attached. Guidance became reminders. Friendly notes turned into follow-ups. The tone stayed polite, but the language narrowed. Less room to pause. Less room to decide. They began quoting the packet like settled law, referencing sections, using phrases like, as outlined in per standard procedure. Every message assumed movement. I hadn't made plans. I hadn't changed anything. And, still, it felt like I was behind. What struck me most was how often they used the word, we recommend. We expect compliance. We found this works best. There was no language for disagreement. Everything was framed as cooperation, even when it didn't make sense. They talked often about future review, about approvals needed before hypothetical actions, about processes I'd need to follow if I ever decided to do something I hadn't even considered. It felt less like support and more like preparation, like a frame being built around me. When I pushed back gently, pointing out the land was rural, remote and not comparable, the response tightened. Still polite, still calm, but shorter, more references to consistency, less reassurance. They reminded me the standards existed to protect everyone involved. That phrase stuck. Everyone involved. The more we spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't a conversation between equals. Authority was already assumed. My role was adjustment. The idea that I might choose not to align didn't seem to register. Someone mentioned that most owners appreciate clarity early on. It was said casually. It's like resistance was unusual. When I understood what was really happening, they weren't waiting to see what I'd do. They were defining what I was allowed to do. The friendliness remained on the surface, but underneath it ran an assumption I hadn't agreed to. That ownership came with obligation, that size didn't change structure, that compliance was the default. I started feeling measured, not watched exactly, just aware that responses were logged, timelines tracked, silence noted. The pace belonged. To them, by the end of that stretch, nothing dramatic had happened. No fines, no threats, no raised voices. And yet, the grip was already there. Light controlled, tightening just enough to be felt. The imbalance wasn't loud, it was organized. And once I saw that, it was impossible to pretend this was just friendly help anymore. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. That's what made it effective. At first, the notices came spaced out just enough to feel manageable. A week or two apart, long enough for one to settle before the next appeared. Each one written in the same calm, polite tone. Clean language, clear formatting, dates, references, expectations. Nothing emotional. Then the spacing tightened. Before I could fully respond to one notice, another arrived. Sometimes two. One by email, followed by a printed copy days later, as if to make sure it carried weight. The timing felt measured, not rushed. Like someone was watching how fast I moved. That's when I understood this wasn't enforcement reacting. Two problems. It was pressure being applied on purpose. The fines followed the same pattern. Small at first, almost reasonable. The kind you might pay just to make something go away. Then slightly higher, and paired with language about ongoing. Known compliance. Even though nothing new had happened, each fine referenced a different section, a different guideline, a different expectation. Individually, they looked unrelated. Together, they formed a net. What bothered me most wasn't the money, it was the confidence. Each notice assumed the last had already been resolved. Each fine treated delay as my fault. Now the timeline existed independently of my consent. The language shifted too, just enough to notice, may result in further action. Could require review, if unresolved escalation may occur. They never explained what that meant. They didn't have to. The lack of detail did the work for them. It left space for imagination, and imagination is always harsher than it. Reality? That's when the pressure turned personal. I saw it in how often my name appeared, in the specificity. Dates, times, references to visits. Photos attached, wide shots, close-ups, neutral angles that made it clear someone had been there with intent. This wasn't casual oversight. It was attention. I tried reaching out to a few neighbors around that time, not formally, just asking if this level of scrutiny was normal. Reactions were immediate and uncomfortable. Short answers, polite smiles, lowered voices. One person told me plainly they'd learned to keep their head down after that. Conversation stopped. People who used to wave kept walking. People who lingered suddenly had somewhere else to be. I wasn't pushed out openly. Instead, space closed around me quietly. That isolation worked exactly as intended. Without allies, every notice felt heavier. Every find felt more personal. For a while I wondered if I was overreacting, if this was just how things worked. If pushing back would only make things worse. That doubt lasted longer than I cared to admit. What finally broke it wasn't another find. It was a small inconsistency. Nearby property clearly violated the same standard I'd been cited for. Open. Ongoing. Not subtle. I watched it for weeks, expecting enforcement to appear. Nothing happened. Then I noticed another. And another. Same rules. Different treatment. The pattern was subtle at first, then undeniable. Enforcement wasn't even it, was selective. That realization hit harder than anything else so far. It meant the authority I was dealing with wasn't clean. It depended on choice. On leverage, on who was easier to pressure and who wasn't worth the effort. Once I saw that, everything shifted. I stopped looking for explanations and started looking for patterns. I compared dates on my notices with conditions elsewhere. I reread the sections used against me and checked how they were applied around the area. I stacked printed emails on my table late at night, highlighted timelines, circled contradictions. The patterns were there. Certain properties never appeared. In records, certain issues were urgent only when they involved me. Deadlines that were strict in my case bent easily elsewhere. This wasn't about rules. It was about leverage. Digging deeper, I found something else. This wasn't new. Buried in old documents and quiet mentions were past disputes. Situations where enforcement had been challenged and quietly withdrawn. Not loudly, not emotionally, methodically. That's when fear finally changed shape. Up until then, fear had kept me reactive. Checking emails constantly, responding fast, trying to stay ahead. Now it sharpened into focus. I stopped asking how to make it stop. I started asking how it worked. Where did their authority actually begin? Where did it end? What was written and what was simply assumed? What did they rely on people not knowing? I didn't argue. I didn't ask for meetings. I went quiet. Instead of reacting, I prepared. Every notice, every fine, every email, sorted by date. Photos labeled with timestamps. Guidelines read line by line, not looking for fairness, but for limits. The more I read, the clearer it became. Some authority rested on habit, not permission. Some standards weren't requirements at all. Some enforcement steps assumed consent that had never been given. The pressure didn't ease. If anything, it increased. More reminders, shorter deadlines, firmer language, but it no longer landed the same way. Each new message felt less like a threat and more like evidence. I noticed something else then. They were escalating faster. Follow-ups came sooner. Language tightened. The pace quickened. That told me they could feel the shift. I wasn't responding the way I had before. For weeks, I'd played the part they expected. Now, I wasn't. In systems like theirs, depend on predictability. The isolation. Still hurt, that didn't disappear overnight, but it stopped controlling me. I understood now why people stayed quiet. The pressure worked best when applied alone. What surprised me most was how steady I felt. I wasn't angry, Anger would have rushed things. The fear that once made everything feel urgent had turned into patience, the kind that lets you wait without flinching. They thought they were wearing me down. In reality, every notice, every fine, every implied threat was giving me something they couldn't take back. Time, and once you understand how to use time, it stops working against you. The decision didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with quiet certainty. One morning I noticed something had changed for good. I wasn't opening emails right away anymore. I wasn't feeling that tight pull in my chest when a new notice came in. I wasn't rushing to explain myself. The habit of automatic compliance, the instinct to respond quickly, politely, carefully, was gone. And I knew it wasn't coming back. From that point on, nothing I did was impulsive. Every move was slow, deliberate, and grounded in their own words. I didn't ignore messages, but I stopped filling in gaps for them. If a question wasn't asked clearly, I didn't answer it. If a demand wasn't tied to a specific rule, I didn't act on it. Silence became a tool, not a weakness. The real work happened away from them. I went back to the documents and treated them like evidence, not paperwork. I laid everything out across. A long table, bylaws, guidelines, amendments, maps, deeds, old notices, new ones. I read them in the order they were written, not the order I'd been sent. That changed everything. Patterns broke. Assumptions fell apart. Some rules were written as suggestions but enforced like law. Others applied only to residential lots, not land like mine, yet they'd been cited anyway. Certain authority claims depended on permission that had never actually been given. I took my time. I highlighted sections, marked margins, compared to what they said they could do with what they were actually allowed to do. The clearer it became, the more obvious the truth was. This system only worked when no one slowed down enough to read it. I documented everything, every fine logged by date, reason, and cited section, every notice placed on a timeline. Where steps were skipped, I noted it. Where deadlines contradicted their own rules, I flagged it. Where enforcement crossed authority, I boxed it in red dot. By the time I was done, there was no uncertainty left. I knew exactly where the pressure came from and where it failed. The next move wasn't confrontation, it was positioning. I responded to their next notice with a short reply, calm, neutral, no emotion. I acknowledged receipt and asked for clarification. Specifically, I requested the exact section granting authority for the demand. Along with confirmation, it applied to land classified like mine. That message landed. Differently, the response took longer than usual. When it came, it was careful. I cited a section I already knew didn't apply. I replied again, attaching the relevant page from their own bylaws and pointing out the distinction. No accusation, just fact. That was the first visible crack. After that, the tone shifted. Messages grew longer, or people were copied in. Words like review and internal discussion appeared. Deadlines quietly disappeared. They were no longer setting the pace. I requested a formal meeting this time. It wasn't framed as support or alignment. It was clarification. They agreed quickly, faster than I expected. The room was the same as before, but the feeling wasn't. Thicker folders. More paperwork, less ease. I noticed how often they looked at each other before speaking. I let them go first. They outlined concerns I'd already addressed. Referenced notices already covered. Spoke carefully, leaving space to retreat. When they finished, I didn't respond right away. I opened my folder and walked through the timeline dates. Sections cited. Sections that didn't apply. Deadlines imposed without authority. Fines issued before review. Each point backed by their own documents. The room went quiet. Someone stopped taking notes. Another leaned back and crossed their arms. Questions that once came easily now met pauses. We'll need to look into that. May require clarification. Confidence drained slowly. When I reached the boundary issue, the maps, the deeds, the overlap they'd relied on, no one interrupted. I showed how enforcement assumed authority across lines that didn't legally exist. When I finished, I closed the folder and waited. That silence said everything. They asked for time. Time to review. Time to consult. The same thing they'd denied me for months. I agreed and left without another word. After that, things unraveled steadily. Notices were paused, then withdrawn. Fines reversed without comment. Deadlines vanished. Authority that once felt assumed now came with qualifiers. They didn't apologize. They didn't need to. The shift was enough. The land felt different after that. Not because anything physical had changed, but because the pressure was gone. The space felt open again, quiet in the way it had been before expectations tried to claim it. I walked the shoreline one evening and realized I wasn't thinking about rules or timelines at all. I was just there. The resolution wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. They had used speed, confusion, and politeness as leverage, assuming I wouldn't slow down long enough to understand them. All I did was take that, its leverage away. Power like that doesn't survive patience, clarity, and documentation. And once it breaks, it never goes back together. It's the same way. The first sign that things were truly changing came quietly. An email arrived without the usual firmness. No deadline in bold. No warning tucked into the last line. Just a short note saying the most recent fines were being reversed, pending clarification. That phrase mattered. It wasn't framed as a favor. It wasn't framed as enforcement. It was framed as uncertainty. More followed. Notices that had once arrived like clockwork were suddenly pulled back. Some were labeled withdrawn. Others were said to be issued in error. No explanations. No justifications. Just a steady undoing of everything that had been stacked against me for months. What stood out wasn't the reversal itself. It was how fast the tone changed once the pressure shifted. Where they once spoke with certainty, they now spoke carefully. Words like may, review, and subject to confirmation appeared where must and required used to live. Emails were longer, but said less. Questions replaced instructions. Silence replaced urgency. They were feeling exposed. It became clear that the authority they'd relied on was being examined from angles they hadn't prepared for. Their leadership stopped speaking with one voice. Messages came from different people, sometimes contradicting each other. Decisions that once took hours now took weeks. Every response felt filtered through caution. Behind the scenes, they were scrambling. I could sense it in the way meetings were postponed, in the way agendas were rewritten, and how often phrases like ongoing internal review were used without details. They weren't just reassessing my situation. They were reassessing themselves. That shift didn't come without friction. At one point, I was informed that enforcement policies were being temporarily adjusted while boundaries and authority were clarified. That was a careful way of saying what I already knew. The lines they'd been pushing against weren't as solid as they'd claimed, and now others were noticing. Neighbors started reaching out again, not loudly, not all at once, just small check-ins. Casual comments, questions asked carefully, as if testing whether it was safe. A few admitted they'd had similar issues in the past but never pushed back. Others said they'd always wondered how far the HOA could really go. The silence that had surrounded me before began to lift. What surprised me most was how quickly the control unraveled once it was questioned openly. All that confidence had depended on people assuming it was justified. Once that assumption broke, the structure weakened fast. Eventually, a final message arrived. It stated that all outstanding matters related to my property had been resolved. That future communication would follow revised procedures, and enforcement would respect clarified boundaries going forward. It was written carefully. It's like something that had been reviewed more than once. There was no apology there. Didn't need to be. The quiet that followed felt different from before. Not tense, not conditional, just quiet. I went back out to the land. Without checking my phone, without wondering if someone was watching, without measuring my steps against expectations I hadn't agreed to, the lake was still. The shoreline unchanged. The space felt open in a way it hadn't for a long time. For the first time since the inheritance, the land felt like it belonged to me, not on paper. In practice, I noticed how my thoughts had changed. I wasn't planning responses anymore. Wasn't bracing for the next message. The background noise that had lived in my head for months had faded. What remained was presence. The ability to stand there without feeling managed. Ownership, I realized, isn't about asserting control. It's about being left alone to exercise it. The HOA didn't disappear. They still existed. They still had rules. But the reach had been pulled back. Boundaries mattered again. Authority had limits, and those limits were now understood, not just assumed. Their leadership moved more carefully after that. Public meetings became more formal, language more restrained, enforcement slower, and more deliberate. It was clear they were trying to regain footing without drawing attention to how much ground they'd lost. Damage control has a particular look to it. Careful steps, soft words, avoiding anything that might invite scrutiny again. I didn't take satisfaction in that. What I felt was relief. The kind that comes from knowing you don't have to stay on guard anymore. From understanding that the balance has settled where it should have been all along. Looking back, the lesson wasn't about winning or beating anyone. It was about patience, about taking the time to understand what you're dealing with before reacting to it. About knowing that systems built on speed and compliance tend to falter when met with calm attention. They counted on me staying polite and rushed. What they didn't account for was what happens when someone slows down. Standing firm didn't mean being loud. It didn't mean escalating or embarrassing anyone. It meant being precise, being informed, refusing to move just because someone expected you to. Now, when I walk the land, there's no sense of intrusion. No invisible pressure. It's just space and time, moving at their own pace. The lake doesn't care about rules or boundaries drawn on paper. Neither does the land. And in the end, neither did I. Control only works when it goes unchallenged. Once it's questioned calmly, clearly, and with patience, it has a way of falling apart on its own.